Part 1. The night Luca lit the table for nothing. Luca had been planning the evening since the third Tuesday of the previous month. He had written a list on the back of an old seed packet: jasmine tea, the good white plates, the small oil lamp his mother had given him, and the silver bracelet he had found at a street market in the old quarter, wrapped in its delicate coil like a secret the jeweler could not keep. The grant notification had come on a Tuesday too, a rainy one, and Celine had burst through the door with it clutched in both hands, her dark hair wild from running, laughing in a way that made Luca press his palm flat against his chest just to feel his own heart moving. He had started preparing the rooftop at 4 in the afternoon. He carried the clay pot of white jasmine up the stairs himself, 2 steps at a time, and set it at the center of the folding table he had dragged up from the storage room. He laid the tablecloth she had made in her first year of textile school, soft cotton the color of old cream, threaded along its border with tiny indigo stitches she had sewn during a long winter. He smoothed every crease with the flat of his hand. He lit the oil lamp. He made the jasmine tea and set it in the small iron pot that kept it warm for hours. By 6:30 everything was ready. The city spread below the rooftop in its usual amber sprawl, taxis threading the streets like gold beads, and the air smelled of rain and stone and, faintly, of jasmine. Luca stood at the edge and looked at it for a moment, the table, the light, the gift in its brown paper, and he felt something quiet and warm move through him. This was love as he understood it, careful and specific, offered whole. Her message arrived at 6:07. Running late. Baby. Don't eat without me. He smiled and wrote back, the tea will stay warm. He sat down in his chair and poured himself a cup and watched the city darken. The candles burned down to their first third. He got up and lit a second set. The food in the kitchen grew cold, and he stood at the stove briefly, thinking about warming it, and then decided he would wait for her to be there when he did. The jasmine flowers were still open. The bracelet sat in its paper. The tablecloth held every crease he had smoothed away. At 9:15, Luca was still sitting in his chair with his second cup of cold tea cradled in both hands. The candles were past their middle now. Below, the city had settled into its nighttime register, slower, quieter, lit differently. He did not check his phone again. He realized, sitting there in the generous silence of his own making, that he had been here before. Not on this rooftop exactly, but in this particular quality of waiting, patient and careful and quietly, completely alone. He did not feel angry yet. He felt something more like recognition, the way you feel when a mirror finally angles itself correctly and you see something you had been half aware of for a long time. Luca thought about all the evenings he had stayed up past midnight so Celine could work with the lights on, all the mornings he had moved his plans to the margins of the week to make room for hers. He thought about the birthday last spring that she had forgotten until he was already asleep, and how she had laughed and kissed him on the temple and said, "You are so low maintenance, Luca, it is almost unfair." He had taken that as a compliment. The jasmine tea in its iron pot was still faintly warm when the sound of the stairwell door broke the silence, and what came up through it was not what Luca had arranged the evening to hold. The man whose coat smelled like someone else. The door opened and Celine stepped through it with Raphael men 2 paces behind her, and Luca had a single still second in which he saw everything at once. Her earrings, the long silver ones she only wore when she was trying to feel beautiful for someone, and the fact that her cheeks were flushed in the particular way they flushed when she had been laughing hard for a sustained time, and Raphael's coat, dark wool, unbuttoned as though the warmth of the evening had only just caught up with him. Celine did not see Luca immediately. She was turned slightly back toward Raphael, finishing a sentence, something about a painter Luca did not know, and her voice was bright and quick in a way it often was not when she came home on ordinary evenings. Luca stood very still in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in his hands. The candles on the rooftop were still burning, just barely visible through the open stairwell door behind him, their light throwing a faint warmth down the steps like a question no one had answered. "Oh," Celine said, when she finally turned and found him there. The word landed softly, but it landed wrong. It was the "oh" of someone stepping into a room they had briefly forgotten existed. "Luca," she smiled. It was a real smile, warm and genuine, but it arrived just a half-second too late, and he had already seen the fraction of rearrangement that preceded it. "You're here. I thought, I texted that I'd be late." "You did," Luca said. His voice came out very calm. He was a little surprised by it himself. Raphael moved into the room with the comfortable ease of a man who had never had to think too carefully about where he stood. He was tall in the uncomplicated way of people who don't notice their own height, with a jaw that held a 3-day shadow and eyes that moved around a room cataloguing it. He extended a hand to Luca with the kind of assured warmth that, in any other circumstance, Luca might have liked. "Raphael Mend," he said. "You must be Luca. Celine talks about you. The flowers downstairs, they're yours." "The shop, yes," Luca said, and shook his hand. There was a beat of silence in which the candles on the rooftop continued to burn without anyone noticing them. Celine moved toward the kitchen and then stopped when she saw the set table through the glass door, the good white plates, the bracelet in its brown paper, the iron pot of jasmine tea that had been warm since 6:30. She stood very still. Luca watched her face move through something he could not fully name, recognition, discomfort, something that looked almost like grief, and for a moment he thought she might cry, which would have been easier. Instead she turned back to him with her eyes too bright and said, with the lightness of someone trying to manage a situation, "Luca, I'm so sorry, I completely lost track of the time. Raphael and I were at the gallery and the opening went long and—" "It's fine," Luca said. And it was not fine. But it was also not yet the thing that would break him. The thing that would break him was still one room away, moving toward them on quiet feet. Part 3. A kiss in the light that was meant for two. Celine moved to the kitchen to put down her bag, and Raphael followed, and Luca found himself standing slightly outside the geometry of the moment, close enough to see it, far enough that neither of them seemed to fully feel him there. He poured a glass of water he did not want and stood at the window and let the conversation wash past him. The gallery, a ceramicist named Petra, an argument between two critics about negative space. The candles on the rooftop were burning their last few centimeters now. Luca could see their light through the open door, gold and wavering, the jasmine flowers a pale blur beyond them. He thought about the 3 weeks of planning folded into that table. He thought about the indigo stitches on the tablecloth. He thought about the bracelet still sitting in its brown paper, which Celine had not yet touched. He decided to go up and blow the candles out before they guttered themselves. He was almost at the stairwell door when Celine said something behind him, something soft and quick, directed at Raphael, and he turned reflexively, not thinking, just turning the way you turn toward sound. She kissed him. It was not long. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of kiss that is given without thinking, without performance. The kind that is only possible between two people who have been somewhere private together for long enough that small gestures have stopped requiring permission. She rose slightly onto the balls of her feet and touched her lips to the curve of his jaw, one hand briefly on his arm, and in the candlelight that Luca had carried up those stairs in his own hands, she was luminous and completely elsewhere. Raphael smiled and said something low that Luca could not hear. Luca turned back to the stairwell door and went up the stairs. The rooftop was quiet. The city moved below in its indifferent amber way. He walked to the table and stood over the candles and looked at the jasmine flowers, which had begun to close for the night as jasmine does. He looked at the tablecloth with its indigo border. He looked at the bracelet in its brown paper. He picked it up and held it in both hands for a moment, not the gift exactly, but the weight of what he had been trying to say with it, and then he set it down again, very gently. He leaned both hands on the edge of the rooftop railing and looked at the sky. There were no stars visible from the city, but he looked anyway, at the orange-grey wash of it, and he breathed. The jasmine smell was very strong now in the still air. Below, through the open door, he could hear Celine and Raphael talking, and the sound of it was like music through a wall, present but belonging to another room. Luca did not feel rage. He felt something stranger and in some ways harder, a kind of radical clarity, the feeling of a photograph developing, shapes coming into definition. He thought, I built this evening the way I build everything for her, quietly, and with my whole attention, and without once asking if she was looking. He blew out the candles one by one. He stood in the new dark and felt the night air on his face and breathed until the breathing felt like his own. The morning Celine tried to put the candles back. Raphael left just after midnight. Luca had come down from the rooftop and moved around the apartment with a quiet efficiency that, he understood later, must have been frightening in its stillness, washing the dishes that had never been used, covering the food, putting the good white plates back in the cabinet. He did not look at Celine, and he did not refuse to. He was simply elsewhere inside himself, in a space that was his and had always been his, a place of deep interior quiet that she had sometimes mistaken for serenity and sometimes mistaken for coldness, and that was in fact just Luca being Luca, someone who processed his pain slowly and privately and thoroughly. Celine stood in the kitchen doorway watching him. She was not with Raphael anymore. He had gone with a handshake and an apology that Luca had accepted without expression, but she had not come fully back into the room either. She stood in the threshold as though she had not decided yet which direction to step in. Luca dried his hands on the dish towel and turned off the kitchen light. "Luca," she said. "Not tonight," he said. "Please." She let him sleep. In the morning he found her in the kitchen before 6, still in yesterday's clothes, sitting at the table with the bracelet in front of her. She had opened the brown paper sometime in the night and the bracelet lay on the tablecloth, the indigo-stitched one, which he had brought back downstairs, catching the early grey light. She was not crying when he came in, but her face held the particular exhausted softness of someone who had been crying for a long time and had come through to the other side of it. She started to speak 3 times before she found the beginning. She said she had felt invisible inside their love, not unloved. She was careful to say that, not unloved, but invisible in a specific way, that Luca's affection was always so quiet, so steady, so certain of itself, that she had sometimes felt it did not need her to witness it. She had felt like a garden that was being tended in her sleep, nourished, yes, but never awake inside the tending. Luca sat down across from her. He listened until she finished. "I hear you," he said, finally. "I think that's true. I think I loved you in the way that made most sense to me, which was quietly. I didn't know quiet felt like absence to you." He looked at the bracelet. "I wish you had told me that. I wish you had told me that 100 times, and I wish I had asked more." He paused. "But I also want to ask you something." Celine looked up at him. "Did my silence ever actually look like not caring?" he said, his voice even, his eyes on hers. "Or did you just prefer his noise?" The question sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Celine opened her mouth and then closed it. The early light was coming in slowly through the kitchen window, falling across the indigo stitches on the tablecloth, across the bracelet, across her hands that held nothing. She could not answer him. Luca nodded, once, gently, as if she had. He pushed back from the table and stood and went to make tea. 2 cups, out of habit, because he had always made 2, and the sound of the water running was the most ordinary sound in the world, and somehow the most final. What Luca planted in the space where she used to be. Celine left on a Thursday. She packed carefully and without drama, folding things with the same precision she brought to her textile work, and Luca helped her carry 2 boxes to her sister's car without being asked. They did not fight. They had said the hard things, and now there was nothing left to shout about, only the quiet archaeology of a shared life being separated back into its original parts. She took the woven throw from the sofa. She left the jasmine plant. Luca stood in the doorway and watched the car turn at the end of the street. He stood there after it was gone, looking at the empty corner, and then he went back inside and made a cup of tea and sat in the chair by the window and let the apartment be silent. Over the following weeks, Luca did not try to fill the space. He did not rearrange the furniture dramatically or paint the walls or invite people over every night to keep the quiet at bay. He lived in the apartment the way he lived in himself, attentively. He noticed where her absence lived, in the left side of the sofa, in the extra cup he still sometimes reached for before catching himself, in the jasmine plant on the rooftop that he now watered alone each morning. He began to spend more of his evenings up there. The rooftop had been theirs and now it was his, and that transition asked something of him, not a forgetting, but a reacquaintance. He bought new clay pots and planted more jasmine, and white salvia, and one small lavender that was perhaps optimistic for a city rooftop but that he tended carefully anyway. He moved the table to a better angle, where it caught the last of the evening light. He wrote no letters he did not send. He had one long conversation with his oldest friend that lasted past midnight and covered everything, and then he let the subject rest. He went back to working at the flower shop with the same focused pleasure he had always taken in it, the logic of arrangements, the way particular blooms insisted on particular companions, the science of making something beautiful that was also alive. The bracelet he kept in the drawer beside his bed. Not as a wound. Just as a true thing that had happened. One morning, 6 weeks after Celine had gone, Luca went up to the rooftop before sunrise and sat at the table with his tea. The jasmine was in full flower, early, The way jasmine sometimes is when it finds exactly the right place, and the city was still asleep below, grey and quiet and lit from within by its thousands of separate lights, each one belonging to someone doing the tender, difficult work of being alive. Luca held the warm cup in both hands and looked at the sky, which was just beginning, at its eastern edge, to understand that it was morning. He thought about Celine, not with anger, not with longing exactly, but with the plain clear sorrow you feel for something that was genuinely beautiful and genuinely gone. He thought, I loved her as well as I knew how to love anyone. I think that was real. I think it will count for something, even now. The first light came in slowly over the rooftops, pale gold, deliberate. Luca took a long breath of jasmine air and let it out. He felt, in the way that the body sometimes knows before the mind has finished its argument, that he was going to be all right, not because the pain was gone, but because he was still, very clearly, himself. His hands were his hands. His tea was his tea. His morning, for the first time in a long time, was entirely and quietly his own. And in that still and luminous ordinary moment, surrounded by the flowers he had chosen and planted without asking anyone's permission, Luca Fura began.